Chapter 4. The Village. In our tradition, on the seventh day of a child's life we have a celebration called Woma, which means seventh, for family, friends and neighbors to come and admire the newborn. My parents had not held one for me because they could not afford the goat and rice needed to feed the guests, and my grandfather would not help them out because I was not a boy. When my brothers came along and Baba wanted to pay, my father refused as he hadn't done this for me. But Baba was the only grandfather I had, as my mother's father had died before I was born, and we became close. My parents say I have qualities of both grandfathers, humorous and wise like my mother's father and vocal like my father's father. Baba had grown soft and white-bearded in his old age, and I loved going to visit him in the village. Whenever he saw me he would greet me with a song, as he was still concerned about the sad meaning of my name and wanted to lend some happiness to it. Malala my wand wala da. Pa tul jihan ke de kushala da, he sang. Malala is of my wand and she's the happiest person in the whole world. We always went to the village for the Eid holidays. We would dress in our finest clothes and pile into the flying coach, a minibus with brightly painted panels and jingling chains, and drive north to Barkana, our family village in Shangla. Eid happens twice a year. Eid al-Fitr or Small Eid marks the end of the Ramadan fasting month, and Eid al-Adha or Big Eid commemorates the Prophet Abraham's readiness to sacrifice his son Ismail to God. The dates of the feasts are announced by a special panel of clerics who watch for the appearance of the crescent moon. As soon as we heard the broadcast on the radio, we set off. The night before we hardly slept because we were so excited. The journey usually took about 5 hours, as long as the road had not been washed away by rains or landslides, and the flying coach left early in the morning. We struggled to Mingora bus station, our bags laden with gifts for our family, embroidered shawls and boxes of rose and pistachio sweets, as well as medicine they could not get in the village. Some people took sacks of sugar and flour, and most of the baggage was tied to the top of the bus in a towering pile. Then we crammed in, fighting over the window seats even though the panes were so encrusted with dirt it was hard to see out of them. The sides of SWAT buses are painted with scenes of bright pink and yellow flowers, neon orange tigers and snowy mountains. My brothers liked it if we got one with F-16 fighter jets or nuclear missiles, though my father said if our politicians hadn't spent so much money on building an atomic bomb we might have had enough for schools. We drove out of the bazaar, past the grinning red mouth signs for dentists, the cart stacked with wooden cages crammed with beady-eyed white chickens with scarlet beaks, and jewelry stores with windows full of gold wedding bangles. The last few shops as we headed north out of Mingora were wooden shacks that seemed to lean on each other, in front of which were piles of reconditioned tires for the bad roads ahead. Then we were on the main road built by the last Wali, which follows the wide Swat River on the left and hugs the cliffs to the right with their emerald mines. Overlooking the river were tourist restaurants with big glass windows we had never been to. On the road we passed dusty-faced children bent double with huge bundles of grass on their backs, and men leading flocks of shaggy goats that wandered hither and thither. As we drove on, the landscape changed to paddy fields of deep lush green that smelt so fresh, and orchards of apricot and fig trees. Occasionally we passed small marble works over streams which ran milky white with a discharge of chemicals. This made my father cross. "Look at what these criminals are doing to pollute our beautiful valley," he always said. The road left the river and wound up through narrow passes over steep fir-clad heights, higher and higher, until our ears popped. On top of some of the peaks were ruins where vultures circled, the remains of forts built by the first Wali. The bus strained and labored, the driver cursing as trucks overtook us on blind bends with steep drops below. My brothers loved this, and they would taunt me and my mother by pointing out the wreckage of vehicles on the mountainside. Finally we made it up onto Sky Turn, the gateway to Shangla Top, a mountain pass which feels as if it's on top of the world. Up there we were higher than the rocky peaks all around us. In the far distance we could see the snows of Malam Jaba, our ski resort. By the roadside were fresh springs and waterfalls, and when we stopped for a break and to drink some tea, the air was clean and fragrant with cedar and pine. We breathed it into our lungs greedily. Shangla is all mountain, mountain, mountain and just a small sky. After this the road winds back down for a while, then follows the Werben River and peters out into a rocky track, The only way to cross the river is by rope bridges or on a pulley system by which people swing themselves across in a metal box. Foreigners call them suicide bridges, but we love them. If you look at a map of Swat, you'll see it is one long valley with little valleys we call dare off to the sides like the branches of a tree. Our village lies about halfway along on the east. It's in the Kana Dara, which is enclosed by craggy mountain walls and so narrow there is not even room for a cricket ground. We call our village Shapur, but really there is a necklace of 3 villages along the bottom of the valley: Shapur, the biggest, Barkana, where my father grew up, and Karshat, which is where my mother lived. At either end is a huge mountain, Torgur, the Black Mountain to the south, and Spingur, the White Mountain, to the north. We usually stayed in Barkana at my grandfather's house, where my father grew up. Like almost all the houses in the area, it was flat-roofed and made of stone and mud. I preferred staying in Karshat with my cousins on my maternal side because they had a concrete house with a bathroom and there were lots of children to play with. My mother and I stayed in the women's quarters downstairs. The women spent their days looking after the children and preparing food to serve to the men in their hujra upstairs. I slept with my cousins Anisa and Sumbul in a room which had a clock in the shape of a mosque and a cabinet on the wall containing a rifle and some packets of hair dye. In the village the day started early and even I, who liked to sleep late, woke with the sound of cocks crowing and the clatter of dishes as the women prepared breakfast for the men. In the morning the sun reflected off the top of Torgur. When we got up for the Fajr prayers, the first of our 5 daily prayers, we would look left and see the golden peak of Spingur lit with the first rays of the sun like a white lady wearing a jumur tika, a gold chain on her forehead. Often rain would then come to wash everything clean, and the clouds would linger on the green terraces of the hills where people grew radishes and walnut trees. Dotted around were hives of bees. I loved the gloopy honey, which we ate with walnuts. Down on the river at the Karshat end were water buffaloes. There was also a shed with a wooden water wheel providing power to turn huge millstones to grind wheat and maize into flour, which young boys would then pour into sacks. Next to that was a smaller shed containing a panel with a confusion of wires sprouting from it. The village received no electricity from the government, so many villagers got their power from these makeshift hydroelectric projects. As the day went on and the sun climbed higher in the sky, more and more of the White Mountain would be bathed in golden sun. Then as evening came it fell in shadow as the sun moved up the Black Mountain. We timed our prayers by the shadow on the mountains. When the sun hit a certain rock, we used to say our Asr or afternoon prayers. Then in the evening, when the white peak of Spingur was even more beautiful than in the morning, we said the Makam or evening prayers. You could see the White Mountain from everywhere, and my father told me he used to think of it as a symbol of peace for our land, a white flag at the end of our valley. When he was a child he thought this small valley was the entire world and that if anyone went beyond the point where either mountain kissed the sky, they would fall off. Though I had been born in a city, I shared my father's love of nature. I loved the rich soil, the greenness of the plants, the crops, the buffaloes and the yellow butterflies that fluttered about me as I walked. The village was very poor, but when we arrived our extended family would lay on a big feast. There would be bowls of chicken, rice, local spinach and spicy mutton, all cooked over the fire by the women, followed by plates of crunchy apples, slices of yellow cake and a big kettle of milky tea. None of the children had toys or books. The boys played cricket in a gully and even the ball was made from plastic bags tied together with elastic bands. The village was a forgotten place. Water was carried from the spring. The few concrete houses had been built by families whose sons or fathers had gone south to work in the mines or to the Gulf, from where they sent money home. There are 40 million of us Pashtuns, of which 10 million live outside our homeland. My father said it was sad that they could never return as they needed to keep working to maintain their family's new lifestyle. There were many families with no men. They would visit only once a year, and usually a new baby would arrive 9 months later. Scattered up and down the hills there were houses made of wattle and daub, like my grandfather's, and these often collapsed when there were floods. Children sometimes froze to death in winter. There was no hospital. Only Shapur had a clinic, and if anyone fell ill in the other villages they had to be carried there by their relatives on a wooden frame which we jokingly called the Shangla ambulance. If it was anything serious they would have to make the long bus journey to Mingora unless they were lucky enough to know someone with a car. Usually politicians only visited during election time, promising roads, electricity, clean water and schools and giving money and generators to influential local people we called stakeholders, who would instruct their communities on how to vote. Of course this only applied to the men. Women in our area don't vote. Then they disappeared off to Islamabad if they were elected to the National Assembly, or Peshawar for the Provincial Assembly, and we'd hear no more of them or their promises. My cousins made fun of me for my city ways. I did not like going barefoot. I read books and I had a different accent and used slang expressions from Mingora. My clothes were often from shops and not homemade like theirs. My relatives would ask me, "Would you like to cook chicken for us?" And I'd say, "No, the chicken is innocent. We should not kill her." They thought I was modern because I came from town. They did not realize people from Islamabad or even Peshawar would think me very backward. Sometimes we went up to the mountains and sometimes down to the river on family trips. It was a big stream, too deep and fast to cross when the snows melted in summer. The boys would fish using earthworms threaded like beads on a string hanging from a long stick. Some of them whistled, believing this would attract the fish. They weren't particularly tasty fish. Their mouths were very rough and horny. We called them chakwarti. Sometimes a group of girls would go down to the river for a picnic with pots of rice and sherbet. Our favorite game was weddings. We would get into two groups, each supposed to be a family, then each family would have to betroth a girl so we could perform a marriage ceremony. Everyone wanted me in their family as I was from Mingora and modern. The most beautiful girl was Tansala, and we often gave her to the other group so we could then have her as our bride. The most important part of the mock wedding was jewelry. We took earrings, bangles and necklaces to decorate the bride, singing Bollywood songs as we worked. Then we would put makeup on her face that we'd taken from our mothers, dip her hands in hot limestone and soda to make them white, and paint her nails red with henna. Once she was ready, the bride would start crying and we would stroke her hair and try to convince her not to worry. Marriage is part of life, we said. Be kind to your mother-in-law and father-in-law so they treat you well. Take care of your husband and be happy. Occasionally there would be real weddings with big feasts which went on for days and left the family bankrupt or in debt. The brides would wear exquisite clothes and be draped in gold, necklaces and bangles given by both sides of the family. I read that Benazir Bhutto insisted on wearing glass bangles at her wedding to set an example, but the tradition of adorning the bride still continued. Sometimes a plywood coffin would be brought back from one of the mines. The women would gather at the house of the dead man's wife or mother and a terrible wailing would start and echo round the valley, which made my skin crawl. At night the village was very dark with just oil lamps twinkling in houses on the hills. None of the older women had any education, but they all told stories and recited what we call tapi, Pashto couplets. My grandmother was particularly good at them. They were usually about love or being a Pashtun. No Pashtun leaves his land of his own sweet will, she would say. Either he leaves from poverty or he leaves for love. Our aunts scared us with ghost stories, like the one about Shagwate, the 20-fingered man, who they warned would sleep in our beds. We would cry in terror, though in fact his toe and finger in Pashto is the same. We were all 20-fingered, but we didn't realize. To make us wash, our aunts told stories about a scary woman called Shasaka, who would come after you with her muddy hands and stinking breath if you didn't take a bath or wash your hair, and turn you into a dirty woman with hair like rats' tails filled with insects. She might even kill you. In the winter, when parents didn't want their children to stay outside in the snow, they would tell the story about the lion or tiger, which must always make the first step in the snow. Only when the lion or tiger has left their footprint were we allowed to go outside. As we got older, the village began to seem boring. The only television was in the hujra of one of the wealthier families, and no one had a computer. Women in the village hid their faces whenever they left their purdah quarters and could not meet or speak to men who were not their close relatives. I wore more fashionable clothes and didn't cover my face even when I became a teenager. One of my male cousins was angry and asked my father, "Why isn't she covered?" He replied, "She's my daughter. Look after your own affairs." But some of the family thought people would gossip about us and say we were not properly following Pashtunwali. I am very proud to be a Pashtun, but sometimes I think our code of conduct has a lot to answer for, particularly where the treatment of women is concerned. A woman named Shahida, who worked for us and had 3 small daughters, told me that when she was only 10 years old her father had sold her to an old man who already had a wife but wanted a younger one. When girls disappeared, it was not always because they had been married off. There was a beautiful 15-year-old girl called Seema. Everyone knew she was in love with a boy, and sometimes he would pass by and she would look at him from under her long dark lashes, which all the girls envied. In our society, for a girl to flirt with any man brings shame on the family, though it's all right for the man. We were told she had committed suicide, but we later discovered her own family had poisoned her. We have a custom called swara, by which a girl can be given to another tribe to resolve a feud. It is officially banned but still continues. In our village there was a widow called Soraya who married a widower from another clan which had a feud with her family. Nobody can marry a widow without the permission of her family. When Soraya's family found out about the union, they were furious. They threatened the widower's family until a jirga was called of village elders to resolve the dispute. The jirga decided that the widower's family should be punished by handing over their most beautiful girl to be married to the least eligible man of the rival clan. The boy was a good-for-nothing, so poor that the girl's father had to pay all their expenses. Why should a girl's life be ruined to settle a dispute she had nothing to do with? When I complained about these things to my father, he told me that life was harder for women in Afghanistan. The year before I was born, a group called the Taliban, led by a one-eyed mullah, had taken over the country and was burning girls' schools. They were forcing men to grow beards as long as a lantern and women to wear burqas. Wearing a burqa is like walking inside big fabric shuttlecock with only a grill to see through, and on hot days it's like an oven. At least I didn't have to wear one. He said that the Taliban had even banned women from laughing out loud or wearing white shoes, as white was a color that belonged to men. Women were being locked up and beaten just for wearing nail varnish. I shivered when he told me such things. I read my books like Anna Karenina and the novels of Jane Austen and trusted in my father's words, "Malala is free as a bird." When I heard stories of the atrocities in Afghanistan, I felt proud to be in SWAT. Here a girl can go to school, I used to say. But the Taliban were just around the corner and were Pashtuns like us. For me, the valley was a sunny place and I couldn't see the clouds gathering behind the mountains. My father used to say, "I will protect your freedom, Malala. Carry on with your dreams."